One ship. 102 people crammed below deck with their animals and their barrels. Blown 500 miles off course by 66 days of storm, until they dropped anchor off the wrong coast. Cold, sick, and with no help coming. By spring, half of them were dead. The 53 who lived built a colony called Plymouth, and today, an estimated 35 million people alive carry a thread back to that one ship. Bradford, Alden, Howland, Brewster, names that might be sitting in your own family Bible right now, a few branches up, waiting to be found. These are 10 Mayflower surnames, ranked from the ones you'll meet everywhere, down to the one name that hides something almost nobody talks about. A genetic signature passed mother to daughter for 200 years, confirmed in the blood of one of America's most famous poets. Check your name as we go. Number 10. Bradford. Old English for a broad ford, a wide, shallow river crossing. Common enough that Bradfords are scattered across Yorkshire to this day. But the Mayflower's William Bradford turned an ordinary name into the closest thing we have to an eyewitness account of the whole voyage. Orphaned young, pulled as a teenager into a secret separatist congregation, he sailed at 30 and went on to serve as governor of Plymouth Colony for nearly 30 years. Elected again and again. His journal, Of Plymouth Plantation, is the reason we know almost anything about that first brutal winter at all. But the man who wrote it all down carried a wound he never fully put into words. While the Mayflower sat anchored off Cape Cod and William was ashore scouting a landing site, his wife Dorothy fell from the ship into the freezing harbor and drowned. He came home to a colony he'd led for 3 decades and a marriage that had already ended before anyone set foot on solid ground. If Bradford runs in your family, you're in unusually documented company. Clint Eastwood descends from William Bradford. So does Hugh Hefner, and so does Noah Webster, the man behind the American Dictionary. The next name belonged to a man who wasn't even supposed to stay. Number 9. Alden. An Old English name, and on the Mayflower, it belonged to a 21-year-old cooper, a barrel maker, hired at Southampton just to keep the ship's casks in order. His contract let him sail home once the job was done. John Alden chose to stay in America instead. Family tradition says the reason had a name, Priscilla Mullins. He married her, and together they raised around 10 children, one of the largest families in the entire colony to this day. John Alden and Priscilla Mullins have more documented descendants than any other couple who stepped off that ship. Their line runs straight through American culture. Orson Welles, Dick Van Dyke, Vice President Dan Quayle, and the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who turned his own ancestors into the famous poem about the courtship of Miles Standish. Legend holds that Standish sent Alden to court Priscilla on his own behalf and lost her. Charming story. No contemporary record actually confirms it happened that way. It comes from Longfellow's poem, written 2 centuries later. If Alden or Mullins sits anywhere in your family tree, you're standing in the branch that multiplied the most. The next name belonged to a father who lost almost everything in one winter and left an inheritance that shaped the colony's biggest family. Number 8. Mullins. We just met Priscilla. Her father deserves his own moment. William Mullins was a prosperous shoemaker from Dorking in Surrey, and he brought his trade across the ocean with him. His packing list survives 126 pairs of shoes, 13 pairs of boots, meant for sale in the New World. He never got the chance. William Mullins died that first winter, along with his wife Alice and his son Joseph. His will, dictated on his deathbed and written down by Governor John Carver, is the only surviving will of anyone who died at Plymouth that winter. Everything he left passed to the one Mullins still standing, his teenage daughter, Priscilla. It helped make her and her new husband, John Alden, comfortable enough to build the largest family on the ship. The shoemaker's daughter inherited the estate. The barrel maker married her. Between them, they founded a dynasty. If Mullins is in your tree, you're standing at the root of that whole story. The next name belonged to the one man on board hired purely to fight. Number 7. Standish. A name out of Lancashire, and on the Mayflower, it belonged to a professional soldier, small, fierce, red-haired, seasoned in the wars of the Low Countries. The Pilgrims were farmers, weavers, tradesmen. Miles Standish was their muscle, the colony's entire military, responsible for defending a settlement in land they didn't understand at all. His first winter took his wife Rose, who died in January 1621. He kept going anyway, founded the town of Duxbury, and guarded Plymouth for the rest of his life. Legend, by a Longfellow, casts him as the gruff soldier who sent young John Alden to court Priscilla Mullins on his behalf, and lost. It's a beloved poem. It isn't a documented event. What is documented, Vice President Dan Quayle descends from Standish. So does Deborah Sampson, the woman who disguised herself as a man to fight in the Revolutionary War. If Standish marches through your family tree, you carry the line of the man who stood guard over the whole experiment. The next name belonged to the colony's voice, the one man whose letter is the reason you've ever heard of Thanksgiving at all. Number 6. Winslow. If Standish was the colony's sword, Edward Winslow was its voice. A printer's son and a gifted writer, he became Plymouth's diplomat. The man who walked into the camp of Wampanoag leader Massasoit, built the alliance that kept the colony alive, and personally nursed the ailing chief back to health. And here's the part that touches your November every year. Edward Winslow wrote the only surviving, first-hand, eyewitness account of the 1621 harvest gathering, the event now remembered as the first Thanksgiving. Almost every image you've ever seen of Pilgrims and Wampanoag sharing that meal traces back to a few sentences this one man wrote in a letter home. Winslow crossed the Atlantic several more times, served as governor, and ended his life in service to the English government. If Winslow sits in your tree, you carry the line of the man who, more than anyone, told the world who the Pilgrims were. The next name belonged to the only passenger who'd already survived a shipwreck that inspired Shakespeare. Number 5. Hopkins. Of everyone on the Mayflower, Stephen Hopkins was the only one who'd already been to America, and how he got there the first time is almost unbelievable. In 1609, Hopkins sailed for Jamestown on a ship called the Sea Venture, which wrecked in a hurricane off Bermuda. The survivors were stranded on the island for months, building new boats from the wreckage. Hopkins was nearly executed for leading a near mutiny on the beach, then talked his way out of it. That shipwreck on that island is widely believed to have inspired William Shakespeare's The Tempest. So when Hopkins boarded the Mayflower years later, he was the one man aboard who'd already seen the New World, survived a shipwreck, and lived to tell it. His pregnant wife, Elizabeth, gave birth during the crossing to a son they named Oceanus, born in the middle of the ocean itself. Hopkins' descendants turn up everywhere: painter Norman Rockwell, Governor Sarah Palin, playwright Tennessee Williams. If Hopkins is in your family, you descend from the only passenger who'd already wrecked once and came back for more. The next name belonged to the ship's one true black sheep. Number 4. Billington. Every community has its troublemakers. Plymouth's were the Billingtons. John Billington came aboard as a hired settler, not for religious freedom, and William Bradford himself flatly called his one of the most profane families on the ship. His son Francis nearly blew up the Mayflower before it even left harbor, firing a musket near an open barrel of gunpowder. It got worse. 10 years later, in 1630, John Billington got into a feud with a neighbor, lay in wait, and shot him dead. He was tried, convicted, and hanged. John Billington holds a grim historical first, the first Englishman executed for murder in the American colonies. And yet the troublemaker's blood runs straight into the White House. President James Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, descends directly from John Billington and his wife Eleanor. So does actor Richard Gere. If you've always suspected there was a black sheep somewhere back in the family, and Billington turns up, you may have just found him. The next name belonged to the one man on the ship old enough, educated enough, and stubborn enough to hold the whole congregation together. Number 3. Brewster. If any single passenger was the soul of the Mayflower, it was William Brewster. He was the senior elder of the congregation, the colony's spiritual leader, and, at around 54, the oldest of the Pilgrim leaders aboard. He was also the only passenger who'd attended university, having studied at Peterhouse, Cambridge, and the only one with real political experience, having once served an English ambassador to the Netherlands.
He'd already risked everything for his faith once.
Brewster ran a secret printing press in Holland that published books attacking the King of England. And when the king's agents came to arrest him, he went into hiding just to make the voyage at all. He brought his wife Mary and 2 young sons with startling Puritan names, Love and Wrestling. He preached and led the colony until his death in 1644. His descendants are a roll call of American culture, singer Bing Crosby, chef Julia Child, journalist Cokie Roberts. If Brewster lives in your family, you carry the line of the educated, stubborn elder who held the whole congregation together when it could easily have fallen apart. The next name almost didn't survive to become a name at all, and without it, the name at number 1 wouldn't exist either. Number 2, Howland. This is the one that came within a single grip of never happening. John Howland crossed as an indentured servant to Governor John Carver. Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, in heavy seas, he was thrown clean off the deck of the Mayflower into open ocean. He should have drowned. Instead, his hand closed around a trailing rope, a topsail halyard dragging in the water, and he held on while the crew hauled him back to the ship, hand over hand, and pulled him up with a boat hook. Half drowned, he lived, because John Howland gripped that rope. An enormous branch of America exists at all. He married Elizabeth Tilley, a teenage orphan from the same voyage, and together they raised 10 children to adulthood, almost unheard of for the time. The list of Howland descendants is staggering. Actors Alec Baldwin, Christopher Lloyd, and Humphrey Bogart. Poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Presidents Franklin Delano Roosevelt and both George Bushes. If you carry Howland blood, remember it every time you hear the name. It all came down to one wet rope and one man who refused to let go. But the woman he married is where this story actually ends. And her name is the one you've been waiting for. Number 1, Tilley. We saved this one for last because it might be the most quietly astonishing line of all. John Tilley and his wife Joan brought their 13-year-old daughter Elizabeth onto the Mayflower. Both parents died that first winter. So did her aunt and uncle. A 13-year-old girl was left completely alone, an orphan, in a half-built colony on the edge of a frozen wilderness, with nearly everyone she loved buried on a hillside. She did not disappear. Elizabeth Tilley married John Howland, the man hauled out of the ocean by a rope, and the two of them had 10 children and one of the largest families in all of early America. The orphaned girl became a matriarch. Here's the detail that gives people chills. There is a documented, unbroken, all-female line of descent from Elizabeth Tilley straight down to Ralph Waldo Emerson, mother to daughter to daughter, generation after generation. Because mitochondrial DNA passes almost unchanged from mother to child, that means Emerson carried the actual genetic signature of a 13-year-old orphan who crossed the Atlantic in 1620. Her own mitochondrial fingerprint passed down intact for 200 years. One honest caveat: this kind of unbroken maternal line match is a documented genealogical fact for the Tilley to Emerson line specifically. It is not something general consumer DNA test can confirm for you. More on that in a moment. If the name Tilley is anywhere in your tree, you may descend from a frightened girl who lost everything in one winter and simply refused to disappear.